Hey guys, Moshi Mochi here, and we're back with the Dragoncraft Steel Rebellion Take 2 Draft Infographic update. So Dragoncraft as a whole, I feel, is suffering right now from sort of its constructive prowess of being a really good ramp deck. If you think about all the tools Dragon sort of has in rotation at the moment to actually be like a really good ramp deck, it definitely has sort of a critical density of good ramp cards, even including something like the Roy that's still in rotation. And that sort of makes side games shy away from printing two specific types of cards. One is just really good sort of things to ramp into in Dragoncraft. We don't have stuff like the Jerva and like Take Two anymore. And then like we have like standard stuff like Dragon Ranch, maybe your Otohimes, just standard like really good big stuff, but nothing that sort of like wins you the game for like skipping a turn or two, like actually playing like anti-tempo ramp. So like the big followers in Dragon have sort of like fallen off or just been printed less, and especially in like the lower picks. Another thing that's sort of missing in Dragoncraft nowadays is sort of like your value Evo pings or your value like freebies. Something like Galua being gone is really starting to show. You only have these as sort of like your mid game and their premium golden legendary picks as well. Just something that you can reclaim the value or just be neutral in game and just swing the board back by for your opponent snowballing you. And like these cards are like really good at that. But if you look sort of in the silver/bronze picks, those are barren. So if you're snowballed against your opponent, it's like sort of hard to come back, barring something like a sneer. And then it sort of pushes Dragon in a direction where they have to like high roll and try to like draft a ramp deck into like some worthy finisher tools, or you actually have to like just draft a tempo oriented mid-range board flood plan and try to win your games off that, and then hope your opponent either stumbles on curve or just doesn't have those like premium tools to sort of remove all your drops. Because sort of as a value craft or like as a hybrid ramp into like decent big stuff craft, Dragon sort of falls flat because all the other crafts have like a lot more value going into like the mid to late game that you just sort of get tempoed out if you just try playing like pure value instead of like relying sort of on the board flood tools or like the tempo tools to sort of rush your opponent out and then like get enough chip damage and try to win the game off maybe like these two or something. So going off into the new cards, first off, we got the Soaring Dragonoid. Looking at it in the base body, it's not really worth it. Maybe the Machina tag is good for like random synergy with like some of your cards, and like that's reasonable. But about drafting it as a one play point 0/1, maybe if it was 0 play point, it'd be more interesting. But can't be attacked, and then you have to work to get the evo from it. If you evo this naturally, it's not very good. You're not gonna evo this and like try to get a freebie like hit off it. Like maybe if you're like getting it for like Dragonoid like trigger or something, most of the time you're actually gonna try to play a spell and then get the free evo that way. And like most of the spells are like reasonably playable, like your oracles, like these. Like you can play it alongside removal and then get like the freebie sort of Dragonoid Scholar from it. And then the Dragonoid Scholar is like interesting into the late game. It can like cycle for free. If you have nothing in your hand, it basically just gives you a free draw. And then in the sort of early to mid game, what you can do is you can just weave out your followers naturally and you can just play whatever your lowest cost is, and then it'll just cycle the sort of next lowest follower. But the fact that this can sort of screw you over on like your curve, maybe you play a 4-drop and like you're lined up for a 5-drop, but you have nothing else in your hand, so it's going to cycle your 5-drop or you're forced not to attack with it, and then you're not really making use of this sort of follower on board. Sure, it's like unattackable and it's potentially annoying, but it's not gonna like win the game off like chipping your opponent for like 6 or something most of the time. Most of the time it'll be just sort of like a random follower on board unless you buff it with like an error or something. And then it requires like a lot of synergy or a lot of like reasons to sort of pick this sort of card up. So it'll be basically sort of on the wayside, especially for like just standard vanilla followers or definitely like Dragon's like very strong mid-range / late game big stuff that there's no reason to sort of like draft this sort of card. Next up, we got the Byron. This card's very interesting. It's sort of like a 2 play point Mars with like a lot of random freebies attached to it. So looking at it as just like a 2 play point Mars, that's like very good for like Dragons. Maybe I want to tempo out or flood the opponent game plan with like new additions like the Doting Dragonoid and the Megafin Diver. It can definitely make some crazy snowball boards out of nowhere. Even like just playing it alongside like a 3-drop after or going first, like it's sort of hard to remove unless the opponent has the sort of 2-drop removal for it. And then if getting like 1 buff is really good, and like 2 buffs off something like your Mars triggers, like obviously it's not as strong like buffing defense, but even like buffing like 1 attack, 2 attack, it's very, very good. Just getting like freebies off that, and it's like a forced removal for your opponent. Your opponent has to intentionally target this instead of like maybe the 3-drop you put on board after. And then if they don't have it, it can like potentially snowball out of control for just being a 2-drop. And then as an additional freebie on top of it, it has like a very premium evo attached to it. It gives like Machina followers plus 0, plus 1 after, and then it summons a Machina follower as well. It's the 1/1, and it gets buffed to 2/2 because of these 2 triggers. So combining this with like additional synergy, like these 2 are like super highly draftable now, and just a bunch of like freebie upside with like evo, like you'll definitely pick this fairly highly. It's got like some sort of downside of just being vanilla. If like all of this doesn't line up, you don't have the evos for it in the late game, or you don't have like sort of like a weave of just really good followers to sort of chain alongside it, then sometimes it's like reasonably bad or just not as good. But most of the time you'll be very happy to pick this card up as just a very strong like early aggro tool that like helps you like snowball games or just make board floods out of nothing with like combos like this. Moving on, we have a new 7-drop in the form of Forte. So 7.54 Storm, you might think, oh, this card's really good, and sort of Dragon's new tempo your opponent out gameplay with a bunch of board flood, and then you just have like a random finisher in your deck. The problem with this is there are sort of other finisher cards you can sort of draft that simulate this effect. While these ones have sort of 1 less attack, they hit in for less, they have a better sort of value fallback where these can actually sort of trade for free. Like the Odin gets the sort of freebie Rackham Ping alongside it, and the Elios sort of, as long as it doesn't trade with Bane-like followers or any like really problematic clashes, it'll just hit in for free as long as it can trade, and they'll get a freebie ward, freebie heal, and all those are like free upside for trading. All Forte gets is just trading in, and it's very fragile, 5/4. It might die, or it might be softened up a lot, be removed much easier by like random soft removal, random pings the opponent has. So just being a fragile body while trading, while Dragon might actually be forced to trade, makes this card potentially like a detriment or not as highly valued as like other cards like these in the value sense. And then like the freebie last words, while it is nice, it's not in the sort of defense stat. So maybe if you're like snowballing your opponent, maybe you can like tempo your opponent out by playing like multiple big drops, and like one of them gets like stacked up a lot with the freebie stats from it. It would be much better if this was like +1, +3. But regardless, it's just free upside on the body. It is random, but it can definitely like help you out as like an extra bit of value that this gets for dying. Unfortunately, this isn't controllable. Otherwise, maybe you can like land it on a storm, land it on a rush for extra like upside / usability. But it's still like around here. It's definitely a very like solid finisher like card if you can't draft like these ones. Last up for the Golden Legendaries, we got the Dragon Ranch. So it's an A++ Dragon Amulet, very similar to something like Canyon the Dragon. The things it spawns are random, and it's in a random order, so that's like unfortunate, but it's just jam-packed with a bunch of stats. Very similar to sort of the effect that Canyon had. It's very strong when you're neutral or head on board, because you can just keep establishing things on board alongside the things you spawn off the Dragon Ranch, and you can just snowball or win a game easily off that. And the fact that 2 out of 3 of these cards can actually interact with your opponent, you might actually be able to interact as soon as you play with this card. The 4/3 Rush and the 5/5 Storm, interacting with board, interacting with face, those are equally as strong. And it's just jam-packed with a bunch of stats, so it's very good in sort of the ramp decks, sort of the tempo mid-range decks, and your aggressive decks especially. So all Dragon decks will definitely appreciate this sort of as a really good win condition sort of pick in Dragoncraft. All right, moving on to the silver picks. So we actually have a lot of stuff sort of in the changelog, so I'm actually going to cover that separately first. So the Gazelle sort of moved up, or cumulatively shifted everything up in sort of a desire to sort of avoid it. So the only thing that's sort of like draftable under it or alongside it is maybe like the Draconic Core if you really have like zero use for this. But otherwise, the Gazelle, definitely there isn't a lot you sort of want to push under it. Like all these cards are like reasonably vanilla / playable on its own. This card, you have to like find the synergy for it, find the uses for it. Otherwise, it's like a 0/2 body. Maybe you can just use it as like free doting fodder, but for being like a free, really cheap Evo. Or then otherwise, you're just looking for some like disdain like cheese where you're like buffing your disdain followers or getting like freebie heals off like multiple triggers. But most of the time in the early / late game, those are the sort of turns where this card's not very useful. Maybe in like the mid to late game, you can actually get like a freebie heal, and it ends up being like semi-premium, but it's like rotting in your hand in most parts of the game. So it definitely sort of deserves this sort of spot compared to like the other cards. You can definitely draft over it. As a consequence of that, these two sort of came up. Like I'll explain these as like new additions after. But Sanctum and the Core, these are just semi-playable ramp cards. If you end up getting sort of like a ramp package or a ramp deck going for you, you can definitely like make use of these cards. Even without like their ramp effects, they might have like potential implications to use over this. But I'll explain with the Draconic Core why it might be that like even here, or maybe like under if you really like want to avoid just drafting the ramp decks. Next up, we got these sort of new additions. Like, I'll explain these cards as sort of like fighter plus kind of cards. Like filler plus, you'll draft them over the ramp if you want to avoid the ramp, and most of the time you may want to avoid just drafting these as solely ramp cards. So no decks are like really sad to play like these cards as just filler fighter drops with like free upside alongside it. Other than that, it's just these two cards that bumped up. The Vile Violet is a consequence of the Galua rotating. There's not a lot of value, like I said, left sort of in your Dragoncraft draft, so you need all the value you can sort of stretch out, even though there's sort of like a balancing of the scales, a sort of opportunity cost to sort of draft this card. Sometimes it doesn't evo, sometimes you need the synergy for it. Just the fact that this may draw you 2/4/ even more cards is just worth the risk of picking, and it can sometimes end up being super premium. It's especially worth noting that if you do end up drafting sort of a high density ramp deck, you do need sort of the Vile Violet dragons to sort of refill on hand for going. It doesn't help you on the tempo, but it helps you on the card draw department where you're just ramping a bunch, and then you're just going anti on cards, and then you need sort of a way to sort of refill. Otherwise, you won't draw enough resources to sort of stay in the game, regardless if you have the value in your deck or not. Last up for the movers in silver is the Elios. It was definitely 2 down before. Just 8.47 Storm. It trades amazingly. It's great in your ramp decks as sort of like pseudo payoff, and then it's great in your tempo mid-range decks, and it's super good in your aggressive decks. And just all the stuff sort of accumulated together, the fact that you trade for basically free and the free storm potential lurking in your deck definitely makes it one of the top picks in Dragoncraft now, especially with like a lot of the value like gone now. That you sort of need to have these sort of effects in your deck to at least try to win the game, or just have sort of that late game power play top deck. Moving on to the actual new silver drops, we got the Draconic Core. So 3+1 Dragoncraft Amulet. It's a Machina, of course, but I forgot to put it in. But for the Machina synergy, it doesn't really matter that it's a Machina just because they only care about Machina followers, but maybe sort of in the future. The rule of thumb still stands for the core is it's only as good as sort of this tagline is. Sort of in the late game, it sort of falls off because turns sort of 7 and 8 where you can benefit from getting the empty evo play point. You're already just playing like a couple mid-range followers along each side each other, or just one sort of big follower. So you don't really benefit too much off sort of ramping in the late game. It's only sort of the enhanced point, and you can even use the Reina for that. And if you can't really make use of the evo, you can even use something like an Era, which obviously it doesn't give the follower coming down rush, but if you're only evoing something on board, then it's equally as effective most of the time. But if you are trying to use this in the early/mid game, what happens is you've gone down 3 play points that turn. It's sort of like a Dragon Sanctum, but then it recovers you to like the following turn. So you're going to be +2 the next turn, but you can't use it to sort of bring out a big follower. What's going to happen is you're going to play maybe like a 4 or 5 drop, and then you're going to weave in a 2 or 3 drop after. But just putting all that down, what happens is you just benefit of 1 empty play point orb, and then you just have 2 followers on board. Most of the time, there'll be a vanilla on board after, and if the opponent has an evo ping or just standard like 2-drop removal into an evo into your other low drop, then they just removed all your stuff, and then you've gone down 2 cards versus the opponent's 2/even 1. So if you're down all that tempo, and especially if Dragon's wanting to play sort of a mid-range board-focused plan, then this card doesn't really help you. It's only sort of a contingency if you sort of want to draft that sort of ramp deck, or you really value that evo point or /Machina tag. But in most of those cases, those aren't really true. So this card might even bump down in terms of being like less desirable than something like a Gazelle, as sad as that sounds. But it definitely is playable in that sort of high-density ramp deck if you can get all the sort of stars to align of just good enough things to ramp into, / good enough draw order, / critical density of just ramp cards to sort of ramp you into the late game, into actual just win conditions or stuff. So next up we got the Assault Dragoon. This one's pretty quick, just 2 play point, 2/2. It's fighter with like random upside. Notably, this one doesn't actually count as a Machina follower. Like I didn't forget the tag. It actually isn't a Machina follower. So it relies on like other Machinas in play. So maybe you'll have like an assembly droid, or maybe even something like this. But most of the time it's just like freebie. Sometimes it'll become the Eliza. Sometimes it'll just be a free fighter. You'll just play it over the ramp if you don't really care about ramp or just want like free stuff on board. It's similar to the Hatchling. Alright, last up we got the Rim Cannon. So this is similarly as sad as it is, just one of the best things Dragon can sort of ramp into. Like one of the biggest drops you can actually draft that you can play and say like it's reasonably good. The fact that it's just free AoE for 1, it's like a Glacial Dragon with like 1 more in terms of stats. And then sometimes it just AoEs for more if you have like just free assembly droids, free random stuff. It's notable that this isn't like a Glacial where AoE is your own board. So it doesn't trigger disdain synergies, but it also keeps your like standard things safe. So just a big enough body, like freebie, like AoE synergy as well. And you're just happy to sort of pick this up as like a value piece that's reasonably big as well. Finally, we're at the bronze picks. So I'm actually going to talk about the changelog first. Similarly to silver, while there aren't as many, there are sort of like some non-changes as well that are sort of relevant. So the serpent drake, I said this in a previous video. Oh, this card deserves to sort of go up. I'm not going to keep that promise, mainly because of some sort of new cards in the format that sort of take precedence over it, as well as like just the safety of this card. It still is like not safe to sort of play this card. You're only relying on sort of either protecting it with random ward or just cheesing your opponent with like some disdainful synergy, which while it can work, it's like inconsistent. Sometimes it'll just be sort of like that pseudo premium evo follower, you evo it in and then you trade with something and then you get the freebie serpent off it, and then you try to sort of win the game off hoping your opponent doesn't have a 2-for-1 to sort of clear all the stuff, or just standard removal, standard AoE to clear all the drakes, and then you can just get infinite drakes off that and win the game off that. While it is somewhat like reasonable to sort of get all that off, something like a Righteous Dragoon, it's just a lot safer. You can just play this as like a standard 3-drop and you get a ton of value just having the hand spurs in your deck, especially with like these and these as sort of like competing 3-drops. Less Righteouses in the pool. Righteous is definitely still sort of the more safer, more reliable 3-drop, at least in my opinion, but you can definitely like value the Drake higher. Like, it's still a very strong card. Similarly, there's Tailswing, now that this is sort of in the pool. While these cards are different, I'll talk about it more sort of when I go over Crush. This card is sort of less draftable, more because you sort of have a similar effect, so you don't need to draft the big removal card. And it's also like not as good in the format, like big removal. So that's the main reason it's sort of down. And like I said in the previous video as well, as the Zealot's up, mainly because of its interactions with a lot of Runecraft followers. The free ping is super strong. You just win free games off just pinging off like 2-1s or 3-1s. That it definitely deserves the free bump, just because the synergy you can get with its disdain cards is also there, as well as you can just play this on a naked board, and then this doesn't penalize you because it won't hit your own thing. And then no other changes here. Like, the Sneer is much better in this format, and like all the other cards are like still stuff like you reasonably draft around the same spot. Like, you can draft the Venom Tail a bit higher now just because of all the split board, but otherwise you're still just trying to draft your actual like good 3-drops in terms of actually pressuring your opponent. So going into the new drops, we got the Boomfish. So the Boomfish is actually an interesting card. It's technically like sort of good. It's punished for Dragon wanting to play sort of a board-focused tempo game plan. If you are actually drafting that sort of ramp package, then it is possible this card can be actually even super premium. Just being an AoE, ramp decks always need its AoE just to catch up on tempo. The opponent's pressuring your opponent out by pressuring Dragon out by like establishing a lot of drops. So if you are that sort of ramp deck, drafting this can be like sort of like a Humpty Dumpty. It's actually got sort of a protection where you can actually evo this. This will be like a 4-1 and after it explodes, and then everything else will take the 3, and then this threatens to explode again, so the opponent sort of has to clear this as well. So this has potential to be super premium. It's just the Dragon decks that you're potentially drafting at the moment aren't sort of those decks that want to AoE the entire board. So the Overwhelming Crush. So it's a hard removal spell, somewhat similar to Tailswing. This one has the benefit of actually hitting something in ambush or something. And if you only play sort of these removal cards in a turn, you can also like subtract something later, and then it ends up just helping you tempo out a bit better in the later parts of the game. And while that is helpful, most of the time, sort of the overflow draw you a card aspect of this card will sort of outclass this kind of card. So you'll be sort of picking your crushes more than your Tailswings most of the time, but they are both sort of in this pool, mainly because hard removal isn't as good in this format, so you won't be drafting it as highly, and you can sort of pick and choose between them, but you'll definitely lean towards the crush when you sort of see it more. So next up, we got the Doting Dragonoon. So this is probably a candidate for sort of the best Evo-specific 2-drop Dragoncraft got. It's definitely the best at sort of like filling up the board, giving you a Fire Drake Whelp either on turn 2 or turn 7. Speaking for the sort of turn 2 application of this card, Dragon is probably one of the best at having like good sort of 2/3 drops to sort of Evo alongside it, or just having enough density of them to sort of make us board flood push of trying to like snowball a game to overwhelm your opponent. This is definitely sort of one of the best incentives to sort of push Dragon towards this sort of game style, and one of the best sort of tools to actually help Dragon accomplish this with sort of not as much value in the pool. So you're very happy to picking like multiple copies of this card up, mainly because it has like that ramp / late game fallback to it as well. Just being a 5/7 really big drop alongside the 1/1 body that trades really well because of the free ping it has attached to it is especially strong. And yeah, free Evo synergy, free upside in the late game. You're very happy to have just as many copies of this card as you can. Last up, we got the Mechafin Diver. So it's a Cyber Cannoneer / Bewitching Succubus, and additional Machina synergy attached. 1/1 Machina, 2/2, and then 1/1 Machina. The fact that the Mechalorca is in a Machina sometimes can be hurtful. These synergies are actually quite good with these sort of cards as like just freebie payoff, because you're already just picking a bunch of Megafins as sort of like board/flood potential. The fact that this is a 4-drop is also relevant. Dragon doesn't actually have a lot of 4-drops that it sort of wants to draft/can draft. So this is a very good sort of board flood / just play this down on 4, going first 4-drop, and you're very happy to just pick up as many of these as you can, just because you want to like conserve stuff like the Griffin back / the Geovore to sort of like a turn 7 sort of onward play. That just having a sort of good stuff 4-drop to play whether you're going first or second is definitely a very nice thing for Dragon to have. All right, I guess that wraps it up for the Dragon cards, and I'll see you on the next one.